For USCFootball.com, I'm Keely Eure here with Shotgun Spratling for instant analysis of USC's Thursday morning media availability. So the one day where we can't see practice. So this is it for us, but we got to hear from defensive line coach Vic So'oto and defensive lineman Tuli Tuipulotu. Shotgun, the thing that stood out to me immediately is it was a continuation of what we heard from Todd Orlando. Non-padded practices, they don't really count. He said that they've had two full of padded practices and those count. He was like, on the defensive side, that's where we count the practices. And that's how he really evaluates his players. What do you have to say?
Yeah, he said, we only count full pad practices, actual practice. He's like running around in shorts. That doesn't count. He says it matters when you're trying to grade people out on the defensive side. It matters whether you can tackle or not. And so that's what they're looking for, especially on the defensive line. It's not just a patty cake game with offensive linemen. You need to be able to, get by people, pull around the pads, avoid being held, be able to make tackles. Those are the type of things that they're looking for. It's interesting. They're moving a lot of guys around. They're dropping some guys into coverage. And he, specifically pointed that out in kind of his opening statement. He said, hey, if you noticed on Tuesday, you may have saw Jamar Sakona dropping into coverage. Jamar Sakona is a guy that you don't think of as someone who would be dropping into coverage. He's a nose tackle. He's a defensive tackle. But he said we're seeing who can be versatile, who can go out and fight for a job and get the opportunity to represent in the fall, and who's going to get those opportunities. And, he mentioned a lot of different guys that have stood out. I think we've been really impressed with what the defensive line has done as a whole from when Vic So'oto has got there. And I think we're seeing just a continuation of that. And, he's done a really good job so far with the troops that he's had. And I'm curious to see where this group goes because we're seeing a ton of competition right now. It's going to be very difficult to break into the rotation, I think, in the fall.
We'll get to the overview that he gave us a little bit later, but I first want to know, I thought it was interesting that we got to hear from Tuley. That's a guy who we saw a lot in the 2020 season, but we didn't get to hear from. He was part of that freshman group who they kind of protect a little bit from the media. So this was our first real interview session with him. But I thought it was interesting when Vic So'oto was asked about his first impression with Tuley, and he said, when we didn't think we were going to have a season in September, we still had workouts, and Tuley was the first guy to show up. And the way that Vic operates, you can tell that really stood out to him. The fact that Tuley was showing up and being the first guy there for workouts.
Yeah, he said, I'm a big first impression guy. And when we didn't have the season, he said, didn't know if it was going to happen. Tuley was still there, one of the first guys getting his work in. And he said it just continued once they knew that they were going to have the season. And he said, what's impressive is that he's a young guy. They put a lot on him already as far as being a leader, doing things his own way, not just following the footsteps of his brother. And, he's developing as a player and a teammate. Now, Tuley's a man of few words, similar to Marlon. We've known this from covering him from recruiting and stuff, trying to get a 3-minute interview. You're like, wow, I got 3 minutes out of him. It's impressive. He's pretty quick with his answers. So we talked to him a little bit too. The most impressive thing that he said was actually when he was prompted from Vic So'oto in the middle of an answer. Vic So'oto was asking, was asked about his group, and he said, Tuley, what do we do on the defense line? And he recites a phrase about how they're to be hunters on the defense line. Yeah, it was very ROTC kind of reminiscent there, where it was a phrase, a pledge that they have on the defensive line, and he was very quick to be able to recite that, which tells you kind of the attention to detail on that with that group.
Yeah.
And that's that, you talk about, I bring up ROTC, the military kind of way about it. And hey, why do you have to, have your shoes shine? Why do you have to make your bed every morning? It's about attention to detail and having that focus. And I think that's an interesting thing to see. And I think we've seen some of that from that group just in their play last year, even though they didn't have an opportunity to have a full spring and didn't have an opportunity to build this culture from then, which is something that was talked about once again, building culture in spring, but they've already started to institute it last year with the little bit of time that Vic So'oto had with them. And I think you're seeing a continuation of that now.
Mm-hmm. As we mentioned, So'oto gave a rundown of pretty much all the players based on how many questions we asked about each individual player. So what stood out to you, Shotgun, about his evaluation so far in spring?
Jacob Lichtenstein, the fact that he said, hey, it looks great in these beach pictures, and he's kind of going, okay, we'll see when we get him on the field. And he said he's brought the full pad mentality to every single practice, whether it's been full pads or not. He said he's brought a terrific mentality into the workouts. Jamar Sakona, once again, gets a shout out from a coach because of the way he's changed his body. And I thought there was a really interesting quote. He was asked about Jamar Sakona's transformation and said, one, he's in shape. And he said, a sign of a good defense is when little guys like to hit and big dudes run. And so that's something that he's looking for out of his big dudes is not, hey, can you be a 330-pound guy that's just, a big guy and tough to move in the middle of the line, but can you run after the ball and chase after it? And I think we saw that last year with Marlon Tuipulotu, early in the season. I believe it was one of the first plays. I believe it was the first game where he knocks a fumble out against Arizona State on a screen pass. And that's big dudes getting out and running to the edges. And that's what you love to see in a defense. So I think you're seeing a lot of positive things on that defensive line. And for him to point that out was kind of interesting to me. So Jamar Sakona, another guy getting a lot of rep. He talked highly of Jay Toya as well, the freshman, but he said, hey, he's got a ways to go to develop. He's got to understand the playbook. Said the sky's the limit for him though. So that's interesting there. Mm-hmm. Brandon Keely was talked about, Corey Foreman, Drake Jackson. He went down the list, everyone. There's questions about almost all the guys. I did also think it was interesting. Dejon Bitten, apparently his nickname is Didi as well. So,
but there's two DDs now, Justin Dedich and that's, too many DDs.
Yeah, but it was interesting because Dejon Bitten's a guy that kind of disappeared last year. He was a guy that flashed a little bit as a true freshman, and you wondered, did he fall out of, favor with the coaching staff? But he said, hey, we saw him out there and he's changed his body just like Jamar Sakona has, and he's doing what he's great at. And he said being twitchy and being fast. So using that athleticism that he has up front to be able to get into the backfield and stuff. So maybe we see Dejon Bitten work his way back into the rotation as well. I think getting into that too deep is going to be very difficult for any of the defensive linemen.
Completely agree. You mentioned Corey Foreman. Vic So'oto talked about him. He was asked, how big of a deal is it that he's not a spring enrollee? And Vic admitted it is a big deal. He said, pointing back to that culture that all the defensive staff has talked about so far. But he also talked about managing expectations. Not only are there high expectations for Corey Foreman, but also Drake Jackson too. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, the first thing with getting guys on campus, it says you don't have those practices, you don't have the opportunity to get in and kind of buy into the program and everything. But he also, a little bit of arrogance from Vic So'oto. He said, my job is to get him caught up, and I'm pretty damn good at that. That was a direct quote there from Vic So'oto. So he has confidence to be able to do that. Drake Jackson, he said, it's pretty much the same as everyone else as far as his development. He's got to get in and make plays. And I think that those two guys, there's high expectations from them, but we haven't seen much from them. We haven't seen anything from them really in the fall so far. In the spring so far. So I think they're playing a little bit of catch up where some guys already have kind of shown out in this first, 4 practices so far.
Mm-hmm. Brandon Keely is a guy that we've seen kind of move around in the depth chart during his time at USC. And you mentioned that Vic So'oto was talking about him, and he mentioned how he's a guy who you look at on the depth chart, you look at his weight, you look at his size, and you go, that's the guy who should fill in for Marlon Tuipulotu. But he said consistency is key. What do you think you need to see from Brandon Keely, or what Vic needs to see from Brandon Keely going forward, Shotgun?
I mean, the big word is consistency. The Family Feud podcast that'll come out in the next day or so, I go on a riff about Brandon Keely, about how he needs to take over the job this spring. And I think it starts with, he got his first practice on Tuesday in the Coliseum. And Vic said one of the goals was to piss him off, and to piss him off and make him mad and create that mindset first, and then everything else would come after it. And now he said he's got to go teach him up on the technique, and that's the consistency portion. It's being pissed off and playing with that high motor all the time, which we've seen from Brandon Keely at times, but then following it with the technique and having a consistent technique. So consistency is the huge word for Brandon Keely. Mm-hmm. Again, he has the size, he has the frame that you're looking for, he has the athleticism, can throw down back handsprings and dunk a basketball. But can you consistently beat your man in front of you? And that's going to be the big key for him. If he brings the energy and the effort, I think he's a guy that can take that starting job, but it needs to start in the spring, because obviously Ishmael Shafshire is a guy that's going to compete for that spot as well. And we're seeing some really positive developments from some of those young guys. So, Vic So'oto did say he would say that Brandon Keely has the best opportunity to fill in for Marlon and Jay because of the age and experience that he has, but it all comes back to consistency.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty, Shotgun, any final thoughts before we wrap this one up? I know it was a lot of information on individual players, but anything else stand out to you?
No, I think it's interesting how they're mixing and matching guys, and I think it's interesting how they're dropping some different guys into coverage just to see what you got. And that's what the spring is all about, is kind of an exploration. It's about creating that culture. It's about, building up guys, but it's also, let's try some different things out and see what we can do. That way, if we need to use it in the fall, then we know that we have it in our back pocket type of thing. So I think it's good to see that they're doing all those different elements right now as well.
Alrighty, that's going to wrap it up for USC's Thursday morning media availability. For Shotgun Spratling, I'm Keely Eure. For more, check out uscfootball.com.